Good day, good day, good day. Thank you for joining me. This is Della Rucker. I'm the principal of the Wise Economy Workshop and author of The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived, What's Changed and How You Can Help. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. It is a stunningly bright, warm, and very sunny day here in Southern Ohio. And one of the kind of exciting little bits right before I got started here was the realization that when the sun is out the way it is today, I go white. So after a little bit of scrabbling about trying to put extra things on top of the windows, I actually have facial features. So we're going to call that a victory for today, because a few minutes ago on this screen, I looked like Casper the Ghost in a wig. So welcome to the joys of independent broadcasting. I wanted to talk a little bit today about another one of the first principles of the local economy revolution has arrived. So the book, I'll actually do it this way because you can see it. So the local economy revolution has arrived is a book that is focused on really understanding how we need to change the work that we do in our communities, whether we're professionals or we're volunteers or we're just passionate about making the places that we care about better, more resilient, and more enjoyable and enlivening for everyone. So it's a book that tries to take a big step back from this is how you use this program and this is how you use that program and this is when this technique is appropriate and all of that kind of stuff. And it tries to take a great big step back and say, okay, what's fundamentally changed over the last 50 years and what's fundamentally changed as we're going forward? What changes can we anticipate moving into the future? Because I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the future that our communities have looks very different than what we might have thought that future was going to be 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And that's not entirely a bad thing. There's pros and cons, like there are with anything else. So the local economy revolution has arrived is really about getting ourselves shifted to a new mindset, to new approaches, to new ways to understand the challenges that our communities face. Because in many respects, they're the same challenges as we've had for a long time, and perhaps we haven't, been very successful in addressing. Sometimes they're challenges that were always there, and some of us were too privileged to realize or to really get our heads around what those challenges were. And in some cases, they're new challenges. They're the result of how the world, whether it's communication or technology or politics or economics, how all those things have changed around us. So that's the purpose of the local economy revolution has arrived. A colleague of mine described it as I use the quote on the back, as a foothold, a good foothold to begin the ascent. I love that quote. So one of the things that was really crucial to me in developing the local economy revolution was to make sure that we had the foundational elements really solid and really in place. So it started with a set of first principles. And first principles, we've talked about this before. First principles are kind of your kind of intellectual and emotional foundation. They're the fundamental precepts, there's a word for you, that we're going to hold as we move forward. They're really crucial for something like this because they help us reframe what we used to be thinking into something new. And we have to be able to do that if we're going to be able to do it differently, because it is so easy for us to just fall back into the same approaches and the same assumptions and the same programs and the same methods that we've used for, in many cases, for decades upon decades. So, our first local economy revolution first principle is actually the one that has a category all to itself, and it's called the driving force. And I'm going to read to you from this, and then I'm actually going to pull from another source, another book that I wrote, to talk about what this actually means, because I didn't want to bog down this book on going into exhaustive details, at least not at this moment in the book. So, here's that first principle. Welcome to the future and to the fusion economy. It's time to put the industrial era behind us. This is the Uber issue, the thing that makes every other first principle not just a nice to have, but crucial and imperative. We are getting left behind by ourselves. The transition that we're currently making isn't between some Internet 2.0 and Internet 3.0 economy, or an information economy and something else. It is much more profound and much more pervasive than that. And we are still too much stuck in the industrial era, especially in how we structure our organizations, including our governments, our public programs, and our businesses. And especially in terms of how we manage people in any of those settings. But emerging technologies and societal expectations and new ways of working are pulling us, sometimes dragging us, into a new place, which I've taken to calling the fusion economy. And I'll explain that in a minute. Many of our most violent struggles come from the deep mismatches between the basic operating paradigms underlying those two economies, the industrial era and the fusion era. A lot of what we did before didn't really work very well, or it didn't work for everyone. But because we were thinking in industrial era logic, we too often didn't notice. And now they work worse than ever. And we do not have that excuse anymore. So, for me, that is the crucial issue that underlies everything. If we still lived in a world that looked like the 1950s, that had the same, and I don't just mean the same technology, but the same communication, the same organizational structure, the same societal structures as we had in the 1950s or the 1850s, or go back as far as you wish, then we wouldn't be grappling with the kind of change that we are now. And very often, we are actually making things much worse for ourselves when we're trying to help a community that we care about become more resilient, become healthier, become more vibrant, become etc. Because we sort of forget that things have changed so much, even since the 90s or the 80s. And we may know that intellectually, but we default back to the ways to run organizations and the ways to manage people and the ways to communicate with residents and the ways to solve problems that were developed when the world was a very different place. So, what do I mean by the world being a very different place? I think we've all got a pretty clear impression of that. Certainly, if you've been around for more than like a year and a half. I haven't talked to anybody 18 months old and younger lately. So, that might be different. But for most of us, that's not news. The challenge is in really understanding what that change looks like. And for that, I'm going to actually step back to another book that I did in 2018. And I don't have a copy of it at hand to show you. I actually prefer, it's hard to tell looking at this office full of paper, but I actually prefer not to have digital materials anymore. I would prefer to carry less weight. But, obviously paper books have plenty of role in the world as well. So what I'm going to read to you is from a book called Everybody Innovates Here that I wrote and published in 2018. So it was early part of 2018. Just like the local economy revolution has arrived, Everybody Innovates Here is available on Lulu, Amazon, and Gumroad. Just search for Everybody Innovates Here. And if it has my name, then that's probably it. So here's how I described that fusion economy, that era that we're moving into. Just like we moved from an earlier era into the Industrial Revolution, we're now making another transition like that, which I've taken to calling the fusion economy for reasons that I actually explain in Everybody Innovates Here, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So this is from an early chapter, and it's kind of setting up my argument for why this kind of change is crucial and why really understanding the change that we're going through is crucial. So, from Everybody Innovates Here. Here's a fully incomplete snapshot of the most profound economic, scientific, and societal trends underlying our changing world. Not only our debates about Twitter and education and artificial intelligence, but about how we go about the work of creating and acting on new ideas. There isn't enough time to even scratch at the variations and range of these impacts, but hopefully this is enough to at least get us all on the same page. First, we're moving from a world where linear projections seemed to work, or at least they were the closest we could get, and when they missed, it didn't seem to matter too much. Moving from that world of linear projection to a necessity of understanding multiple possibilities. In business, you often hear the term VUCA, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and agitated, I forgot what the A is, world. We find more and more that we can't realistically assume that a given input will produce a given outcome. And we have to design our systems and our lives around an expectation of uncertainty. So, for an example of that, think about the fact that the average job tenure today is 3 to 4.5 years. And the young workers are expected to have 12 to 15 different jobs in their lifetime. Compare that to the world that many of our parents came up in, where you worked pretty much for one company or one organization for 15, 20, 30 years. We're seeing a decline in the impact of conventional types of authoritativeness and a rise in what we might call unmediated or non-dominant information alternatives. And the example that I gave is that most of the time if there's an event unfolding in the world, I learn about it from a scatter of voices on my Twitter feed rather than from, as when I was a small child, from Walter Cronkite or Tom Brokaw in the nightly news. That's a very different way of getting information, and there's lots of ramifications to that. This is one that I think is particularly important. We're seeing a new kind of power that's coming out of loose networks or dispersed systems. And that shows its strength every time we have a Kickstarter launch or an online protest. Now, that loose network power often faces all opposition, and the old systems are often trying to hold on as hard as they can. But there's a definite shifting of those sands. And for anybody who's claiming to be an expert or an authoritative source, that's becoming a harder and harder position to hold. And I think that's part of a reaction to that is part of the rise we see in sort of authoritative behavior in certain sectors, including politically. You have to fight a lot harder if you're going to claim to be the authority or the authoritarian than you used to be, because you're basically pushing back against the tide. And we all know how that goes eventually. We seem to be seeing an increasing awareness of interdependency. It's one of those words I can make a gobble of if I have to. We seem to be seeing an increasing awareness of interdependencies, a dawning realization that a policy decision in China or damage to a fishery in the Atlantic or a mistake at a warehouse that I didn't know was even in the next town over can have a direct and immediate impact on my own life. And again, that evolution of awareness is incomplete. We still, as we talk about with a lot of the other first principles, we have a tendency to think of ourselves professionally, personally, in terms of our families, as an autonomous unit. But that awareness of interdependence seems to be seeping into the general mindset in a way that it hasn't very often up to date. Now, all of these, none of these are entirely mature, are entirely new, rather. None of these are entirely new. And none of them are fully understood or internalized all across our world. And some people are outright resisting some of these forces. And some of these are only coming to our awareness now because it used to be that we were comfortable enough to ignore them before. But again, that distributed information and that power of network and sense of interdependency means that we don't have that ability. But regardless of your political or your social leanings or your economic theory or your love of technology or your hatred of technology, it would be very hard for a cogent person to not notice that some very fundamental things are changing. So within that macro context, I ask, and everybody innovates here, how do we inclusively innovate? So it's kind of fun when you start realizing that one piece of work that you've done intersects with another piece. It gives a little bit of a sense of wholeness. And for me, that's pretty cool. It took me a lot of years of doing to get to the point where I could make sense of some of these uber issues in my own head. As I've said in a lot of places, because I grew up in Cleveland during the Rust Belt in Cleveland, Ohio, I kind of had a front row view of the beginnings of this transition. And so when we're telling this story, we're telling the story of certainly the world that I have lived in from the time that I was about old enough to have any awareness of what was going on. And as I tell in the Local Economy Revolution, that hit home for me as it did for thousands and probably millions of people worldwide in a very immediate and in your face kind of manner. And it's not surprising, but it's also sometimes a little frustrating to me that after all of these years, literally my lifetime, and I'm 52, so I didn't fall off the truck yesterday. After all of these years of living through this evolution, that we still so often don't do the mental work, the organizational development work of redesigning, of reframing and redesigning what we do. So often we just go back to our accustomed models. And the older I get, the more the conflicts that I see, whether it's at a very local level or an interpersonal level or a multinational level, comes so much from an old world hanging on, an old approach trying to consolidate power, and a new approach that is so fundamentally different. And particularly for those of us who care for communities, who care about the places that matter to us, whether that's our job or that's simply our love, that's really hard work that we have to do. And it's the hard work of being very conscious about evaluating the assumptions and the expectations and the models and the programs. Everything as basic as how to run a nonprofit, how to run a public meeting, what a community should look like, who belongs, who is valued in a community. We so easily, without even realizing that we're doing it, fall back on what we learned, back many, 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 many years ago in school, in our communities we grew up in just the world that we came up in. And it's a challenge. It's an extraordinarily deep challenge. And I say this from very personal experience. It's an extraordinarily deep challenge to consciously reframe what you're thinking and what you're doing based on that thinking. And that's not just the work of an Elon Musk or some artificial intelligence programmer who's creating the new world. That is the job of every one of us, particularly when it comes to those of us who are focused on making the communities that we care about more resilient and healthier and more vibrant and better places for people to be. And so that's why that transition from industrial era to fusion era, that's why that moment that we are in, and that's why our understanding of that moment that we are in is so crucially important. If we just go and do programs and we say, oh, well, town X ran that program and we should take that and we should bring it here and we should implement it. And well, why didn't it solve anything? I don't know. It looked like a good idea. Let's go on to the next thing. That's not an effective way to do this work anymore, because we're moving into something that is very different from where we've been before. So we must be much more intentional. And we must be much more conscious of the fact that we're making that transition. And that transition is going to last longer than a lot of us are doing this work, longer than a lot of our lives. But it's crucially important. And the longer we wait before we help our communities get oriented in that direction, the harder it's going to be for them to thrive. And at the end of the day, I know that in your gut of guts, that's what you want for the places that you care about. So thank you for spending time with me today. If you're interested in reading The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived, it is available on Gumroad. So that's gumroad.com. It's available on lulu.com. And it's available on Amazon if you prefer to be an Amazon user. The book that I mentioned previously, Everybody Innovates Here, is also available on those same platforms. And you can get them in digital format for your iPad or your Kindle. You can get them in print hard copy like this. You can even get it in a PDF if you want to, work in that manner. I'm also getting ready to work on a audiobook version of The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived. I'm looking forward to doing that. I love reading out loud. I sometimes garble my words, so it'll be interesting to see how this actually comes out. Can't imagine, how that might shake. But so I'm starting production on that this week. As a side note, I have a new microphone. My old mic that I've used for podcasting and the like for many, many years finally kicked it. So I had to, pony up for a new one. If you hear anything in the sound of this recording that you're either like, yay, great, or that was awful, let me know, because I'll listen to it later, but the more ears, the better. So thanks so much. Again, Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived, available on Gumroad, Lulu, and Amazon. In addition, if you want to stay up to speed on the cutting edge of how that local economy revolution is playing out all over the US and all over the world, join me on Substack, wiseeconomy.substack.com. I do a weekly newsletter that gives kind of a little summary of a few key early indicators that I'm seeing out there and a little bit of reflection. And there's some additional resources that we're getting ready to produce as well. So thanks again so much. Really appreciate your taking the time to listen. And no matter how you are working on the place that you care about, you go get them. You're going to be great. Thanks.